Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Eva Leigh, a USA Today romance author who has always loved romance. She writes novels teeming with determined women and men with replete libidos. Eva and her husband, author Nico Rosso, a fellow romance author at that, live together in a central California community. Now imagine the romance and sexual chemistry in the Rosso Leigh household, writing, research, and action, one would imagine. But, she isn't all work and no play. Eva enjoys baking, spending too much time on the internet, and listening to 1980s music. Her book titles under the name Eva Leigh include An Education in Pleasure, Scandal Takes the Stage, Temptations of a Wallflower, 2 Rakes for Mrs. Sparkwell, A Rogue's Rules for Seduction. But she also writes in multiple romance genres under pseudonyms Zoe Archer and Alexis Stanton. Now, I said multiple romance genres. I actually am not sure about that, but we'll find out from Eva. Eva, welcome to the program, and thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
Talk to us about why the multiple pseudonyms. Are you actually slicing and dicing within the romance genre, so you wanted to differentiate in that way as well?
Well, initially I started as romance author Zoe Archer, and the reason why I used a pen name is because I had also write in like commercial and literary fiction. And so I have another name, and I wanted to make sure that for shelving purposes, there wasn't any confusion. So I started out as Zoe Archer. And then when I moved to Avon at HarperCollins, they, and I'd been writing as Zoe Archer for years, but when I moved to HarperCollins, they suggested I try a new pen name. So that's where Eva Leigh came up. And then the Alexis Stanton, I wrote a few romances for Hallmark, and my romances have a very high heat quotient, and Hallmark does not. And so it was thought that it would be judicious to use another pen name for the Hallmark, just in case we didn't want anyone to get upset or befuddled if they came across some of my other work. So that's kind of how these many pen names came into being.
Now, are you one of those romance authors, because I've heard of them before, that write romance to make money, but then write literary fiction because that's what they really care about most? Is that part of the equation here?
No, it is not part of that equation. I write romance because I love romance. And I would venture to say that anybody who goes into writing any genre fiction, but especially romance, with the sole intention of being commercially successful at the expense, or what they believe to be, they're going to set their writing skills aside in order to just sort of churn out product to make money, you're going to find that your readers are going to realize that you're entering into it from bad faith. And your product is not going to be very good because you yourself don't care for it. Like, romance authors are romance readers and they love romance. And so I would caution anybody who thought, I want to make some fast money without a lot of effort. I'll go into romance. I would say that's that's a pretty harmful position to take. So I would say maybe go somewhere else. But So
dilettantes need not apply.
Exactly.
So what does it mean to be a USA Today romance author? I haven't heard that phrase before.
I'm a USA Today bestseller. That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So there was an anthology that I was in with several other romance authors that made the USA Today bestseller list. And so once you get that, they can never take it away from you. And so you make sure to brandish that wherever you can, because everyone likes a little air of legitimacy, and listing is one way in which I think we sort of use as a criteria for like gaining some of that legitimacy. So I'm a USA Today bestselling author.
There you go. So how did two romance novelists come to be husband and wife?
Well, when we first got together, Nico and I, we were not both romance authors. Nico had ventured into he was a writer, but he did other writing. But because he learned about romance through me, and was very receptive to it, very open to it, not judgmental at all. And is actually one of my critique partner and my beta reader. But as he was reading it and got to know the community, he really enjoyed it, really liked it. And he liked the supportiveness of the community, generally speaking. And he liked the hope and sort of the ethos behind romance. And so he started writing romances too. And as a matter of fact, the Romance Writers of America they used to have, I don't know if it's extant anymore, but they had the Rita Awards, which was their major award for nominations that they do every year for romance. And I'd been nominated twice, but Nico has also been nominated for his romantic suspense. So that was pretty awesome.
Now, does he actually write under his name, or can a male legitimately write romance, or does he write under a woman's name? Well,
Nico is not his name. But he also didn't want to be disingenuous by using a woman's name, because he felt like, and I agree that there's a certain amount of trust in a relationship between a romance author and their reader. I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of the subject matter, because it's about emotions and openness. And so by disguising himself, he felt with a female pseudonym, it just sort of felt like, well, there was this obfuscation going on. And so he wanted to use something else. So he went with Nico, because he's half Greek and half Italian. So that was a name that was pretty, it felt.
There you go.
Yeah.
You got a foot in both tribes there.
Yeah.
Now, does it hurt sales at all for a male byline to be doing romance, or do women trust male writers to understand a female's sensibilities when it comes to the bedroom and the restaurants and all areas of romance?
Well, I mean, I think it's not even about sexuality. It's about emotional intimacy, and it's about seeing the person.
That's why they wouldn't trust a man, though, right?
Right. Well, and I would say that there is some reticence, especially if it is a man writing male, like a male protagonist and a female protagonist, because there are people of all genders who write queer romance, LGBTQIA romance, I think, and they will write about their own experience. And I feel like maybe in that regard, there might be there's not the same kind of caution, I think, that there might be when somebody like a woman reads a man writing women, because it's like, there, unfortunately, I think, sometimes there's a lot of trouble when certain genders write other genders, and they don't necessarily
lack of understanding.
Yeah, lack of understanding, and understanding also what the reader wants, not even like how somebody functions, but it's like, there's a difference between a romance hero and a man, and they're not necessarily the same. So having an understanding and a respect for what readers want, I think, is very important.
Well, if you take the pool of romance readers out there, and there are millions of them, it's a huge genre. What percentage are women versus men? Do we have a sense of that?
Well, the RWA used to post statistics annually as to the breakdown in terms of age, race, education, gender. I wouldn't know off the top of my head, but I know that information is widely available. I would say, by and large, the traditional published romances are read predominantly by people who identify as women. But that doesn't say.
Notice how carefully you worded that.
Well, but then there's, but it's,
20 years ago, we would have just said by women.
Right.
But
I want
everything's been subdivided quite a bit.
It has, but the thing is that I welcome the fact that we are expanding and recognizing that there's many different kinds of gender expressions and sexuality, and
it gives you more places to go, right? You and Nico more places to go with the.
Well, I mean, I also want to make sure that people are writing from their own experience. You know what I mean? You don't want to like co-opt somebody's own experience for your for your purposes. Exactly.
But you do research. I mean, and research to this extent might be that you know somebody who is non-binary or whatever, and you spend a lot of time talking to them and understanding, and then writing accurately about it. Is that fair?
Well, I would say that I've done a lot of work in trying to unpack my own biases and also understand my position of privilege as a white heterosexual cisgendered woman, and understand where that positions me as a writer, as an artist, and things like that. And I feel like I took this excellent class by a romance author by the name of LaQuette, and she gave this really phenomenal class about writing through these different lenses and things like that. And it really made me wonder, like I want to make my world and my books as inclusive as possible, but that also means I cannot write, me personally, this is my belief, I'm not comfortable writing from the point of view, like a point of view character, like a first person or a close third of somebody who's I feel like might be able to tell their story and understand their nuance much better. So that means I myself I like to include in my books characters of color, characters who are LGBTQIA, and at the same time, my point of view characters are characters that I feel like I'm not like telling somebody's story for them. I don't know if that makes sense, but sort of like I have secondary and tertiary characters who have experiences that I don't have, and I'm not attempting to speak for them.
Okay, so the primary characters, though, are ones that you feel completely comfortable with, that it's your experience, you understand it. If you're talking about an LGBTQ type person, they would be secondary or tertiary. And am I understanding you correctly or not?
Yeah, that's correct. And the thing is, like as I said, I want to make my books inclusive. I want to make them representative. I don't want to exclude anybody. And at the same time, I also don't want to take anybody's seat at the table, because we know that publishing is a very exclusionary place with a lot of gatekeeping. And so I feel like, especially as Ava Lee writing historical romance, there's a very limited number of places that a traditional publisher, for example, is going to say, all right, I'm going to write, we're going to publish a book by a queer author or an author of color. And it's like, well, if for me to kind of muscle in and be like, I'm going to write a story where the protagonists are people of color. Well, that's like, it ensures that, I'm not going to write to that person's truth. And that I'm also going to make sure that also ensures or makes more difficult somebody who has been excluded from publishing. It keeps them out even more. So I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that everybody gets a seat at the table. So this is why I try to negotiate it as best as I possibly can. I'm not saying it's the solution. It's the one that I've come up with for now. And I hope that it will continue to evolve as I evolve and learn more and listen more.
Yeah. And just to be clear, so nobody misunderstands me, when I said to Eva that, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you would have just said a woman, but we have subdivided things. That is not a protest on my part. The fact that we are more inclusive is a good thing. And it only creates a richer mosaic for people like Eva or me to write about. So, but let's talk about the ethos behind romance. You said that Nico, your husband, he I don't know your exact words, but you basically say he came to appreciate the ethos behind romance. What is the ethos behind romance?
Well, if we're going to kind of take it in the broadest cultural context, because we're sort of speaking like in terms of like a lot of times, traditionally romance was defined as, or at least the stories that we're getting told were stories about heterosexual men and women having relationships. And we're prioritizing and emphasizing emotion and agency and sex positivity. And these are things that a lot of times we don't necessarily see in other aspects of literature. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of the denigration and sort of the misperception of romance, or at least the way in which a lot of the sort of criticisms of it or dismissal of it, it has a lot to do with the position of women in society and how we value women and what women are valued for and things like that. So, we come across a lot of stories where women's emotional needs are not necessarily taken into account, or they're diminished, or the female characters are murdered, or, and it's like,
You must be watching the Lifetime channel.
Yeah, well, but, a lot of thrillers are like that,
Yes.
There's that concept where they call fridging the woman, where it's like the hero has the tragic backstory or something. The movie or the book opens with a female character who's close to the male protagonist getting brutalized or murdered or something like that. And that sends the male protagonist off on his journey of revenge or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, that's, we're trying to sort of reassess gender roles and things like that. So, and what's really great too, is that as publishing is hopefully getting more inclusive, we're also seeing happily ever afters for people who are, like, well, obviously a gay person can't have a happily ever after if this is a historical romance. Well, it's like, well, we know that that's not true. Same with people of color. We know that they're happily ever afters. But so the sort of notion of hope and agency and all the things that make sort of life rich and wonderful, these are things that are prioritized within the romance genre. And that's really nice to see.
Describe your marriage to Nico and Nico's marriage to Eva. Give us a peek under the kimono, so to speak.
Well, the thing is, it's a partnership. It's a collaboration. It's a partnership. It's an integrated process. We both have been writing most of our lives. And so we talk a lot about writing and the process of writing and what it means and what we're trying to do. And Nico has this concept, which she calls meta writing, which is about like, what are you trying to say? It's not just the story, but what are you saying? What is, behind these stories? And so we talk about that a lot. So I think about, and I know he does, when we think about what are the larger issues that I'm trying to address, and not necessarily like political pot banging, but just sort of in general thoughts about relationships and people and human beings and the human experience. It's like we both have these larger ideas as to what it is we're attempting to do with our writing. And so there's no rivalry. It's it's very collaborative.
Yeah. So there's that, you mentioned metadata and subtext that is part of what you're delivering with the writing. Do you and Nico synchronize your writing time, and do you write in the same space?
Well, we
I realize you're independent writers. You write your own stuff.
Yes, we do.
But at the same time, maybe just in terms of just life management, you might say, let's if we're writing at different times and we're taking time away from each other.
I think we generally try to coordinate our writing times together. That way we know, like, okay, now it's time to have lunch, and now we're both going to go run some errands and things like that. So back when we lived in Los Angeles, we shared an office, and we actually measured the distance between our desks, and it was 8 feet. But now that we've moved, we each have our own offices, which is nice. We just go in, put our headphones on, and get to work.
So you do listen to sound or music. You're listening to 1980s, yes. Dee Snider and 9 Inch Nails.
Actually, I am a British new wave girl all the way. So Thompson Twins, Duran Duran, Depeche Mode, Tears for Fears, Adamant. Those are all some of my favorite acts.
Gotcha. So, talk about the differentiation between how you write versus Nico. It's kind of cool that here under one roof and one marriage, you've got two writers. I know it's not unheard of, but how do you write versus Nico?
I feel like there's more like in terms of when
Like
it comes
process.
well, I think Nico's a more solitary writer than I am. So he kind of goes into his cave and does his work, and we'll talk a little bit when we break up about it. But when it comes to my work, like I said, it's very collaborative. We spend a lot of time together plotting my books together. And then when I write my pages, and then usually at the same time that I submit them to my editor, I will also give the book to Nico, and I get his input as well as her input, and then I kind of synthesize what it is that they're both looking for when it comes to doing revisions.
So who's the superior writer, you or Nico?
Oh my goodness, what kind of question is that?
Oh,
I am absolutely not answering that.
Okay. We got to keep that marriage intact. How many years have you been married?
Well, we have been married now. In April, it will be 18 years, but we generally go by when we first started seeing each other. So actually, as of this year, it's been 25 years.
25 years. Congratulations. And I will tell you, Eva, I do the same thing with my wife. When it's an anniversary and people say, how long you've been married, I tell them the number of years that we've been together.
Right.
Because for all intents and purposes, that's what really matters.
Yes.
So I'm totally on board with you there.
Well, for a romance novelist, when it comes to things like marriage, I'm not very invested. I'm invested in commitment. So when Nico and I got married, we went to City Hall and we had literally one witness. So it was like we didn't need a ceremony. That wasn't the thing that it was about. So it was more about when we first started seeing each other. That's when we made our commitment to each other.
Yeah. How did you actually meet, though?
We met briefly in college, and then were sort of reintroduced a few years later by a mutual friend.
And which college are we talking about?
We went to UC Santa Cruz.
UC Santa Cruz. Oh, wow. Yes. Okay. Surfing and cocaine and all that stuff going on there.
I would say it was more like weed and hacky sack, and I did neither of those
I
things.
love it. All those bohemians. I love the vibe there.
Yeah, it's great.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the current level of romance in your marriage?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you define it. We've been together for 25 years. And we are together all the time. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not a very romantic person per se. So I appreciate a romantic gesture. So I would, I guess 9. 10? I don't know.
Wow. You score high. Well, you write about romance, and you write about people who obviously are engaged in romantic activities. Maybe that's kind of there's a little bit of vicarious living through that. Certainly the readers live vicariously through your writing. Well, do you feel it? You live vicariously through your own writing at all?
I mean, I think so. I would, sometimes I feel a little guilty because I'm basically making people pay for my therapy sessions, because a lot of what I'm writing on the page is a lot of aspects about things that I like to see in the world. And I in terms of like things, not that I lack them in my life, but I appreciate when I am appreciated and seen. And so, and that's what a lot of my romances are about characters who find each other and see each other, really truly see each other and appreciate who they are, rather than preconceived ideas as to who their family wants them to be or who society wants them to be. So I feel like I like to put that out there so that, it's something that everyone can experience. And I feel like there's this idea that romance readers read romance because they themselves are sad or lonely or don't get these things in their lives. And I think, again, that's a misogynistic fiction. I think people who read romance actually are really good at advocating for themselves when it comes to what they want out of a relationship, in terms of their emotional needs, and their sexual needs too. And I think it's been pretty well documented that people who read romance novels lead very healthy sexual and emotionally fulfilled relationships. It's not because they're like, oh, I lack this, so I'm going to read this. It's like, it's supplemental. And it also gives them joy and hope in the midst of a timeline, especially now, that's very dark. And so romance is extremely important to people.
I've heard, and you like it hot, because I've heard in an interview where you said, you want steam coming off that page. Now, that's under the Eva Leigh name. Is that right?
Because
Go ahead.
Zoe Archer but Eva Leigh has definitely been very, very hot. I think it's even hotter than my original stuff. But I think people, especially outside of romance, they get hung up on this notion about the sexuality because maybe there's something about women's sexuality, people predominantly women's sexuality, that I guess is forbidden or taboo or disdained or something like that. And it's just like, I think sex can be for some people a really important part of their relationship, and getting your needs met is critical in any regard. And so this is one manifestation of how you get your needs met, especially because in these books, it's like if you're reading a heterosexual romance, the female main character's pleasure is central. And we're so used to sort of making women's pleasure either sort of tangential or not necessary, or mocking it. And this is like, no, we're owning it.
Yeah, yeah. And when you write a sex scene, this is not going to be a male who is selfish, who is just fast to the finish. It's almost going to be at least some of those scenes, I would imagine, would be a good instruction manual for a man to understand how a woman might want to be treated in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I would advocate if somebody is a heterosexual male and they want to learn more about heterosexual, or just women's sexuality, I would say, pick up a romance novel. I think there could be a lot in there that might be surprising and might be enriching.
Well, don't you think it's true that, and this is a generalization, but men tend to think of intimacy as sex. And I would say almost any woman you ask what has been the most intimate moment of your life, they probably wouldn't refer to sex. They'd probably be referring to something that was tender moments, that the cuddling, or where the man was there for them in a way that was really significant.
Well, women enjoy sex. They like it. I mean, not every woman wants to have sex, but many women do. And they enjoy it. And it's something that is an important part for many women. It's part of their lives. And it also has to do with the communion between characters. So, yeah, there's the orgasmic aspect of it, but there's also the attention to their needs at that moment. There is that emotional and sort of psychic intimacy that happens as a result of that. So, I mean, I don't know how colorful my language can be. It's like, yeah, women like to fuck and they also like to cuddle. I mean, they're both things exist at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, well, I'll leave it at that, but I would like you to, a little bit later on, read one of the sex scenes for us.
I'm going to actually have to say that I decline. I'd be happy to read another scene, but if I'm not a trained reader, and so I would rather, and usually when there's an audio sample, it's not a sex scene. So I think I'm going to have to pass on that.
Okay, but you would read something.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me, we'll do that a little bit later, but what are some of the you're in a successful marriage by, it certainly looks that way. So what are some of the practices? I mean, is there anything that you and Nico do, any practice or practices that you think help solidify a marital relationship?
I think listening is like one of the most important aspects of it, and being there for the other person when they're going through something, and really hearing them and what it is they're going through and what it is they're experiencing, and being there for them at that moment is really important, and communication is central to that. There's a psychologist named, I think it's John Gottman. His last name is Gottman anyway, and he specializes in relationships and communication, and he has this really great list on ways in which you can communicate with somebody that helps the other person feel seen and gets your own needs met. And I think utilizing and implementing those kinds of things can make for a really strong relationship, regardless of your just I think it's just important for everybody in any kind of romantic partnership, however it expresses itself, to utilize that.
And that's Gottman.
I think so. It's
we'll
on
look
my
it
shelf,
up. We'll Google it.
Yeah.
We'll Google it.
Yeah.
So under the name Eva Lee, how many books have you authored thus far?
As Eva Lee, I don't know off the top of my head. I know.
How about in total?
Total, I would say, I think it's 35, 36.
Under the 3 pen names.
And also I wrote a literary fiction novel that got published a while ago by a small press under my own name. So I think it's like 36 books.
Wow. So you're very productive. How frequent do you turn out a title?
Well, for my Avon titles, I was turning out I would say about every 7 months I would produce a full-length novel, which was between like 75 and 90,000 words.
75 and 90,000. So that's a full-scale novel. And that's
yes.
How often?
About 7 months.
Okay. That's fast. So you're how many hours a day do you put in, or hours per week?
Well, I actually don't have a lot of physical stamina for writing. So I would say if I put in more than like 3 or 4 hours, that's a really big day.
Yeah.
I've been using the Pomodoro technique, where I will sprint for 25 minutes and then take a break and then go back and then do that for maybe 3 or 4 times and then take a longer break. So I try to maybe do like 6 to 8 sprints a day. So I keep myself from getting burnt out. Some people can write very, very fast, and some people are slower writers. And I would say that all methodologies are valid so long as it works for you.
What got you started in romance?
I started like writing really soon after I learned how to read as a child. So I was writing stories really early, but in high school, a friend of mine, her mother read romance novels and would loan her romance novels to her daughter, and her daughter, my friend, would loan them to me. And I was probably about 14 or 15, I guess, when I started reading them. And it's a pretty common origin story for most romance authors that they got into writing romance because they were big romance readers. And that's what happened with me. Like, I basically started trying my hand at writing romance in high school, but really didn't sort of codify my process and really make it an effort until after graduate school. And that's when I had day jobs and things like that, but I would get up early in the morning and write. And then eventually I was able to write full time. And so that's what I've been doing for a while.
Why is the romance, and now this actually you may have already answered, but let's take a second bite at this apple. Why is the romance genre so massive in terms of readership?
Well, I would say that romance readers are voracious. They can read many like within the span of a few days, a romance reader can read several titles. So there's a very large demand for it, I think, in a way that maybe other genres might not experience. So I think that might have something to do with it. I think that, romance readers, I think that they have done some studies, and their education level predominantly includes a 4-year degree. So it's a large readership, and one that is always is very enthusiastic, and there's a really strong sense of community, especially with the advent of the internet. The romance reading community is really, for good and for ill, has increased. So I think that contributes to just the incredible size and demand for romance novels.
Now, when you were young, when you were a youngster and you were just getting going and you were starting to read romance novels, who was Rosemary Rogers one of the people you read? Who were some of the authors who kind of lit you up?
Well, I started reading romance in the 80s. I'm a Gen Xer. And like Bertrand Small and Rosemary Rogers they were authors from the 70s. And I did read some of their books, but I was reading a lot of Judith McNaught. Who else did I read a lot of? Jude Deveraux. Kathleen Woodiwice, she's another 1970s author. As soon as somebody asks me questions as to like who are the authors that I was reading back then, I go blank. In the 90s, I was a huge Mary Jo Putney fan. So I was drawn even then predominantly to historical romance versus contemporary romance. I was much more interested in the historical time period. I think I just found that a lot more fascinating, and engaging for me.
Do you think most people have healthy attitudes about sex? Actually, let me amend that question. Not most people, most Americans have healthy attitudes about sex.
No, I don't.
Tell me what the attitude is. Where's the disconnect there?
I feel like, well, in our current political climate, there's a lot of disconnect because there's punishment for sex and sexuality through forced pregnancy. So I think that's a problem. I think there's a huge idea of sort of like women not being able to be sexual, at least without the same consequences that a man can have consequence-free sex. I think when it comes to people who are LGBTQIA, there's just a massive amount of problems when it comes to something that literally involves only that person. So I think one of the reasons why romance novels can be so popular is because it is a safe space where it comes to people's sexuality without this sort of puritanical judgment or punishment or all of these other sort of misconceptions that we have about sexuality, and that we can sort of engage with that part of ourselves in a way that makes us feel validated.
Mm-hmm. So I can't get you to read one of your sex scenes, but tell us what the essentials of a good sex scene are.
A good sex scene, I mean, there are so many different kinds, because there's erotic romance where the plot is advanced through the sexuality of the characters. And there's romance that doesn't have sexuality, like overt sexuality on the page. There's asexual romance. There's all there's closed door romance. For myself,
what do you mean by closed door romance?
Closed door romance means like the door is closed on the scene, or like you would pan to the fireplace.
You don't really, it's something's happening behind the door, but you don't know.
Yeah, but you don't get to see, then you cut to the next morning kind of a thing without actually having to see it sort of as it were on camera. Gotcha. So I think a good sex scene for me is about the validation, particularly of the female main character's identity and journey, and her celebration by the male main character. It does advance the story, and it has a lot to do, and the story meaning like also their emotional journey as well as the actual like external plot narrative. So I like to implement them to show the growing connection between the characters, and that can mean that they can express their sexuality very safely and celebrate it together.
Now, you have said that you like to produce hot copy. You want that book to have some steam to it. Why is that the case? Is it that your readers, that you feel that the readers want that delivered? Is it something that you really enjoy writing?
I think it's a combination of both. I know that I do enjoy writing these scenes. I find them fun and interesting, and I like the challenge of making them innovative and different from one another. Some readers really like to have a much hotter content in their books, and I like to be there for them. In a way, it is pushback against a puritanical society. I get criticism from readers that they don't like how hot my books are, but other readers really, really like it, and I'm writing for them.
Right. Yeah. I just read for the first time. I years late on this, but Lady Chatterley's Lover, which of course was banned for the longest time, and it's so tame by today's standards.
Right.
And it's also beautifully written. It's just a great story. It's beautifully written and so on. Where and how do you push the envelope?
Well, I feel, the stereotype of the purple prose, as they used to call the way in which romance novels address their sexuality in terms of euphemisms and similes and language and stuff like that. I like to be a little more Anglo-Saxon when it comes to my terminology. So it's a little, I don't know if I call it crude. But I also kind of like to take it outside of the sort of traditional realm of standard positions and locations and things like that, because it is also a form of wish fulfillment. So, a lot of people don't have a carriage at their disposal being pulled by a team of horses. So it's like, okay, this is the time that we can actually get to, have a little fun with that.
Let's just get in the woods and do it.
Yeah, exactly. And we're safe. You know what I mean? That's the thing. That's one of the things about sexuality in romance novels is it's safe. That is to say, there is predatory behavior has no place here.
Or there can be dominance and submission type behavior, but it's consensual and it's done, it's role playing,
right?
And it's done safely.
And it's fantasy. I think sometimes people, there's accusations where when there's BDSM in romance or non-consensual sex in romance, it's like, well, obviously that means that the readers don't really need that in their own lives. It's like, well, no, in the context of this particular safe space, they can indulge in these kind of taboo fantasies, but no, it's going to be okay. Unlike in the world outside of the pages of books, where there's so much predatory behavior and so much damage being done. It's like, okay, we can kind of explore these things, all of these darker fantasies, but we know it's all right.
Right. Yeah. And, not required. It's not required to create the excitement that people are looking for. So let me push the envelope with you a little bit. Is there a common sexual position that you use more than any other in the writing?
In the writing?
Yeah.
I usually put the woman on top.
That's a cowgirl.
I guess you would say that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I find it thematically important.
In what way? Elaborate on that.
Literally the woman is on top, but also metaphorically she's on top.
Mm-hmm. And anatomically, she has more control over her orgasm in a situation like that.
I mean, you can align yourself in positions that sort of increase your own stimulation, whereas from straight missionary, penetrative sex is not a very reliable methodology for achieving orgasm, especially if it's in the missionary position. So there's other ways, you can kind of control it a little bit better, I think, when you, if it's a heterosexual sexual relationship, or then she's on top.
Yeah. And men love it too, because they're hands free and she's all there. And although I will say that I think that as women get older, they don't like the cowgirl position anymore, because they're afraid that that things start to come forward, that they don't like leaning forward. And this has been my experience, is that,
I think the thing is
reach a point where they feel like that's not my primary position anymore. I'm not at my best there.
What's beautiful about sex is that it can take so many different expressions. It can be so many different acts. And this whole notion that sex only constitutes a penis and a vagina is it's not true. And the way in which we express ourselves sexually and intimately is there's so many different ways of doing it. So it's why not open it up, and let it be whatever it is that we want it to be, as long as we're consenting to it, as long as it makes us feel good and it brings us closer to our partner, then let's go for it.
Yeah. And I would say to the women out there that what I just described, you look great. Don't let it bother you. It doesn't bother men. And, I just think women get so self-critical about their bodies and how they look. And they're so concerned that somehow it's one of those double standards where men just don't worry about it the way women do. And it's the sort of thing where I think an aging woman is not, to me, that's not degradation. It is not, you're not, an aging woman has character. It's not.
Well, look, our culture does not value women over a certain age.
True.
We are told to disappear once we reach a certain point. And if we don't look a certain way, we're not valuable anymore. So we're being told by our culture that our value is predicated on our sexual desirability and our attractiveness along a certain code. So, it's going to be hard to unlearn those messaging, because everything around us is telling us to feel shitty about ourselves. And it's like, that's one of the things about romance novels that can be great, is that we can sort of, we can unlearn these things, and we can learn to embrace the things that make us special and important.
So one more question before I have you do a little bit of reading, and that is, what are readers, I realize this is, you'd have to peanut butter this answer, but what are readers' expectations when reading romance novels? I'm thinking in terms of just the overall gestalt. What is the kind of full experience that they're looking for, the expected experience that a romance novel should deliver for them?
There is basically one thing that a romance novel needs to deliver on, and that's where romance novels differ from stories with romantic storylines or plot lines versus like actual genre romance. Romance has to have a happily ever after, or at least a happily for now, but it needs to be upbeat, that has the characters committing to each other. That's basically what a romance novel has to provide. And beyond that, it's kind of like fair game, depending upon the reader and the scenario.
So no open-ended endings.
I would say, generally speaking, that a romance novel has to have the emotional commitment of the characters by the end of the story. So that's why when you read certain books which are characterized as romance, but one of the characters dies or they don't wind up together or something like that, that's not a romance novel. Romance novels are about the happily ever after.
So give us a few, being that this is your genre, you're a writer, you're very much steeped in this whole romance genre. Give us a few movies that you think were really delivered in terms of romance. Maybe not in the same way that you would expect from a book, but like would Body Heat with Kathleen Turner be it? No.
Nope.
Or Unfaithful with Richard Gere?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. Fire away. Give us a few.
I obviously my mind has just emptied out of that. I would say, I just recently watched Fire Island on I can't remember what channel was airing it, and it's a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice that's set on Fire Island in New York, and that was a great story. And we didn't necessarily even I felt the emotional connections between the characters. I really enjoyed that quite a lot. Most modern rom-coms, I'd say, generally have that, but oh God, it's when
how about Wuthering Heights?
No, that's not a happily ever after.
No, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. So you could say that Jane Eyre does have the happily ever after, but it's so problematic when it comes to the nature of the relationship between Jane and Mr. Rochester, and also who Mr. Rochester is, that that could be problematic. People like Austen adaptations because they do provide the happily ever after, and that's part of that author's enduring popularity.
Well, you are equating movies to the requirements of a romance novel, though, that we got to have a happily ever after. But maybe a great romance movie, The Way We Were, a lot of people love, and that was not a happily ever after, but it was very, a tender ending for sure.
There's plenty of there's a lot of movies out there that are very romantic. are they necessarily like what, like I guess we're sort of trying to compare apples and oranges in terms of determining like what is a romantic and what is a romance. And so Romeo and Juliet romantic, is it a romance? I don't know. I don't think so. But that's also my judgment,
Sure.
and gatekeeping can be highly problematic, but it's also especially problematic when somebody comes into somebody else's house and tells them how to think or feel about the work that they do or the books that they read.
What are you going to read for us?
I'm going to read to
book?
You from...
even before you do that, if somebody has never read Eva Leigh, but they want to get started, is there a particular title that you would say, I would start with this one?
I'm going to read it today, as a matter of fact. And it's called The Good Girl's Guide to Rakes. And it's the first book in a series called The Last Chance Scoundrels. And it is about three men who are tasked by their families to marry women of good reputation within a year, or else they're going to be cut off from their inheritance because they've been too scandalous in their past. So they have to settle down. So that's the book. I'm going to read the first book from the first book in that series.
All right, go for it. And why don't you give us 2 or 3 minutes of it? All
right, let me just put my reading glasses on because, as I said, I am Gen X and my eyes don't function as well as they used to anymore. Are you certain you haven't mistaken me for one of your sophisticated paramours? Impossible. His disbelieving laugh was not flattering, with all of its implications. Why seek me out? She folded her arms over her chest. His expression sobered. You are aware of the ultimatum your father and my parents have placed on me, Finn, and Dom, that we all must find brides of good repute within a year or we're to be cut off? I'm aware. How could she not be? Dom had moved back home a little over a fortnight ago, and thunderous arguments between him and their father had ensued. Since their mother had passed away 5 years ago, the lack of Ma's soothing, mitigated presence was acutely felt whenever Dom and their father were together. The trouble was that Dom and Ned Kilburn were far too much alike and loved each other deeply, resulting in almost constant conflict. Though Dom was poised to join the family business, contention was ever present between father and son, especially because Dom seemed to enjoy flouting convention at every opportunity. His preferred methodology had been tearing a path through London's wilder corners with the Ransom brothers, but now that carousing had to come to a stop. Not that it had, not for Dom. Then you understand my need for a respectable wife, Kieran said. She held up her hands, warding him off. I'm not going to marry you. Oh, God, no, he answered at once. Well, that was exceptionally unflattering. Dom knows precisely what manner of scoundrel I am. If I married you, he'd use my entrails as a necklace. Peculiar how this statement made her feel a trifle less terrible. Of what benefit am I to you, then? She asked. He bent close to her, which, in an already confined space, brought him very near. His scent surrounded her, a thrilling mix of wood smoke, leather, and herbs, and she could just see how stubble already shaded his chin. If she bent just a little closer, she could kiss him. Involuntarily, she dipped her tongue to her bottom lip. What would he taste like? Surely something forbidden and delicious. As if he could hear her thoughts, his gaze dropped to her mouth. She could have sworn that his eyes darkened and the column of his throat worked. And wouldn't that be thrilling, to be kissed by rakish Kieran Ransom in the fitting alcove of Madame Jacqueline's modiste shop? He blinked, straightening, and disappointment thudded in her chest. You're the most respectable woman I know, he said. I'm the only respectable woman you know, she countered.
Very, very good. Very good. I love that entrails, turning entrails into a necklace. Bridgerton is a series on Netflix. I think it's Netflix.
Yes.
Is that one that you consider to be more in line with good romance?
Well, Bridgerton is based on a series of novels by a romance author, Julia Quinn. So, yes, I would say yes. So
in there, yeah, that's it. One of the wonderful things about these streaming series is that unlike a movie where you have 90 minutes or 2 hours, when you can do multiple episodes in multiple seasons, you can actually really cover the novel in a way that's much more. I mean, you could do War and Peace if you had 10 or 10 or 12 seasons and 10 episodes per season. So it's really been a boon, I think, to writers of books. Now, explain to me, why did you say you did not want to read a sex scene? Because you're just uncomfortable with it, or you don't feel like you do that well? Not the writing of it, just the reading of it.
I'm not uncomfortable with it, but I feel a little like Stacey Abrams when she went on the Colbert Show and somebody sort of put, Stephen Colbert put that book in her hand and sort of put her on the spot and stuff like that. I feel like it's kind of a personal thing, and I feel like it's between the reader and the book. And I don't want to interpose myself in there. I see.
I get it. What don't men get about women? Is there something that you would something you'd point out, or a few things you point out that men don't really get about women that you try to render in the books?
I sometimes wonder if, speaking broadly, in the most kind of with painting with the biggest brush possible, if men understand that women's interiority is just as complex and nuanced as theirs. I feel like we are characterized, again, speaking broadly, as mercurial, shallow, or overly emotional. And it's like, I don't know if male consciousness comprehends female consciousness in its breadth, in its complexity, and its everything. And I'm not saying like it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, but everything a man thinks and feels, women feel and think that too. And thinking them, we are different from each other in some ways, but there's other ways in which it's like you have to recognize that women can contain contradictions. They can contain sadness. They can contain joy, motivations, things that, exist even beyond their relationships with men, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships. So it's like, you need to understand that, like, literally we're people. We are literally people too. And I don't know if that always seems to come across. At least I don't see that in our legislation, and I don't see that necessarily in our cultural products all the time either.
Well, okay, when you get talk politics, I absolutely, but just the opposite has been my experience, where men are considered very simple. What is sex and beer and football, and women have always been seen as complicated. But I guess it just depends on your perspective.
Well, I think
women seem to think a lot more. Women are much more nuanced. They seem to think about a lot more dimensions. Their thoughts seem to be more dimensional than men, where men tend to be a little bit more black and white.
Well, maybe it is understanding, nuance. And also, it wasn't until fairly recently that female consciousness and ideology was considered to be much more simplistic than male consciousness, like that a woman couldn't possibly be a philosopher, or
right, or you could never do business.
Right, exactly.
They're too emotional to do business.
Right. I mean, and like all of these things that there's this sort of like facile, sort of like childishness about being a woman, that and like that women lack gravitas or any of those things. So I think it's like this sort of idea that guys are just like chest thumpers who just want a man cave. I mean, I think that does them a disservice, and it also sort of it also makes the relationships between the genders that much more problematic by rendering it in like these kind of binaries.
Right. Have you ever read or seen a lecture by Esther Perel, the sexologist? Do you know her, Esther Perel?
I'm not familiar with her.
If you just plugged her name in on TED Talk, she has some great TED Talks, but she is very she goes a long ways towards giving people a much healthier attitude towards sex, and she comes across as just very sexual herself, and just one of those people who I think I think you would enjoy what she has to say and write. And so I bring her up because when I was thinking about some of the topics I wanted to discuss with you, she just popped into my head. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Cool.
Can you tell us what is the and I'll wrap it up with this, unless you wanted to add anything. Is there a particular aspect of your writing game that you consider particularly strong? One of the analogy or one of the examples I use is that Elmore Leonard, the old detective, the late detective novelist, I used to say he writes dialogue like he invented it. He was like a great dialogue writer that people would say. What is it in your writing game that you think is your biggest strength, if you could identify one?
Well, I like my dialogue. It takes multiple passes to get it right, because sometimes I'll do like first draft kind of dialogue where it's just the characters are saying what they're thinking or feeling. And then you kind of need to go back and sort of like, is there another way that this would be said? Does everybody always say exactly what they're thinking or feeling? No, there's usually some kind of, obfuscation or ulterior motive or something like that. So there's that. I also like the nature of the way I describe the characters' relationship to each other, because for me, it's always been really important that my protagonists, we understand the why behind their relationship. It's not just that they want to get into bed together or that they find each other attractive. It's like there's something intrinsic about each character that feeds something in the other. And I feel like I generally try to show that and do a relatively good job in demonstrating that on the page.
Well, I'm going to have to get my hands on a copy of the Good Girl's Guide to Rakes. Did I get the title right?
Yes.
That's a great entry point right there. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm.
To Eva Leigh's writing. Eva, this has been a lot of fun. Is there anything that maybe I've omitted? Anything about your writing in the genre and so on that you might want to add?
No, I think I just kind of want to reiterate that, writing, regardless of if it's a genre work or not, it involves work and it involves craft, and romance is no different.
Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.